to the Consulting Day event hosted by St. Andrews Enterprise Week, a student-led initiative to introduce the community and students to a diverse set of entrepreneurial events to make entrepreneurship accessible to everyone. For today's event, we have Ellie Hearne, a St. Andrews alumni and founder of Pencil Ink, as our first speaker. Before I hand it over to Ellie, I would just like to tell everyone that if they have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll moderate them once Ellie is done sharing her journey. Or at that point, you can also raise your hand and unmute yourself and I'll call upon you to ask your question directly. So Ellie, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Sabi, and thank you all for joining. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about my journey, and that's precisely what I'll do, but I also want to make this useful and practical. So I'm going to try and do that through the lens of what's helped me along the way and what things I thought were obstacles and that sort of thing as well. So as Sabi mentioned, I studied at St. Andrews myself, and I studied IR. And for me, consulting and entrepreneurship were not a natural fit at all. I first sort of started my career looking at how I could use my IR degree, which I had a certain amount of success with.
Thank you for presenting.
You did a good time.
Yeah.
Are you good to continue? Okay, so I see thumbs going up, so I'll take that as a yes. So I grew up actually quite near St. Andrews, near Dundee, and it's novel for me living in New York not to have to explain what that means and say, no, near Edinburgh. And then when they say, what's Edinburgh? I'll say, no, further north of London. Anyway, I decided that I really wanted to work in New York and go through explaining where Dundee was to a lot of people in my career. So that sort of took me across the Atlantic, and I had to get a work visa because I'm not an American. And I think part of the reason I mention that is looking back, I had to show quite a sort of entrepreneurial spirit to be able to do that and to be able to find a job here. And, you know, I had a few things going for me, but it also wasn't terribly straightforward. And I ended up working after, you know, having coffee with a lot of different people around the city. I ended up working at a think tank called the International Peace Institute. So I was directly using my international relations degree, which was great. And I was doing editorial work, communications work, which later would sort of set me up for what I was going to do after that, which was great as well. But throughout that process, I think one of the things I learned was the sort of relational skills are often as important as technical skills. So it was definitely helpful to have a very nice St. Andrews degree in international relations. Like I could not have done it without that and without the network St. Andrews opened up to me. But being able to connect with people, to really forge my sort of connections into something of a network was really a game changer. Like I started applying to jobs just cold when I was sitting in my flat on Byer Street next to the theatre, or Abbey Street next to the Byer Theatre. And I had a phone interview with a different think tank in New York when I was in my 4th year at St. Andrews. And I didn't get the job, but the guy who interviewed me kept in touch and said, you know, if you are coming to New York, I'd be happy to talk to you and open up my network a little bit. And I'm glad I kept in touch with him because he introduced me to a few people in his network. And I am part of the reason I said I'm not a natural consultant or entrepreneur is I'm quite shy and introverted. So the idea of just meeting with some random people from this man's address book was terrifying. But I'm glad I got over it to a point. I think nerves are healthy in general, but I got over it. I met with a lot of different people, and I also applied to other jobs cold as well. Like the more irons I could put in the fire, the better. And it ended up being one of the people that this man introduced me to, whom I'd connected with from St. Andrews, was the person who helped me, first of all, told me about this opening at her organization. So that sort of networking, even done from your bedroom, which is really the only type of networking we're all doing at the moment, really made a big difference. So I was at that organization for a few years. I loved aspects of it. I loved living in New York, and I loved the people that I worked with and everything else, but I realized that it wasn't a perfect fit for me. And to be blunt, I wanted to make more money, and I wanted to have more of an impact in terms of, maybe I am a good consultant, but I wanted to have more of an impact in terms of the work that I was doing. And while this think tank was affiliated with the United Nations and doing very good research, publishing a lot of really interesting stuff and convening a lot of interesting events, I sort of, on this journey through using my IR degree, I realized that no matter how good a paper I wrote or edited about counterterrorism, it probably wasn't going to stop anyone from, you know, bombing anything. So maybe I should have set my sights at a little bit different level. But I ended up realizing that I really liked the communication side of the job, so the writing and editing. I'd also led a couple of informal workshops, and actually looking back at my career, those sort of side projects were the ones that actually led me to connect the dots to where I am now. So I said I wanted to use the bulk of time for Q&A, so I'll just very quickly take you through what I'm doing now and where I am now, so you can tailor your questions accordingly. After that think tank, I decided to work in India for a few months. I worked at a different think tank there, again doing counterterrorism work in New Delhi, and that was a great experience, and I'm very glad I did it. And then after that, I'd sort of given up my US visa, so I thought, well, I'm a British citizen, I will go to London. That is the natural place for me. And I love visiting London, but I'm not a Londoner and I really miss New York. So I was doing a little bit of consulting there, trying to sort of burnish my private sector credentials, having been working in nonprofits and think tanks. And during that time, I realized, you know what, I miss New York. And on a personal level, I was invited to a wedding in New York. So I thought, well, I'll go to the wedding, but I'm also going to interview for jobs while I'm there. So I did that and went through the sort of visa dance again. And at a certain point, and I think this will resonate now, especially with the sort of economy the way it is, my net in terms of what I wanted expanded much, much wider, to the point that I was just like, anything in communications, private sector, phone companies, anything with communications in it, I'm ready. So I interviewed with advertising companies and branding and all the various flavors of communications. But I ultimately found, through somebody I used to work with, again, these sort of networking connections are so important. I found a small company that was based in San Francisco with offices in New York that did more sort of relational communications, which is really what I do now. And I worked there for about 4 years. I then decided to start my own small business, Penciler Inc., like Sabi mentioned. And what we do is really about relational skills. So what does that mean? We do one-on-one leadership coaching. We do group workshops and sort of skill sessions on things like executive presence, on things like leadership skills, leadership savvy, and team effectiveness as well. And we facilitate offsite retreats. Right now, they're mostly virtual, as you would expect, but I think they might be in demand when offices get smaller and people work from home more. And we also do a lot of work in culture communications and culture consulting. So the sort of glue that holds companies together, especially when many of us are working without a traditional workplace at the moment. So that's what Penciler Inc. does. We do it with a lot of different clients. And they were sort of mentioned in my bio, and I always feel weird talking about them. But I've worked with a lot of large sort of Fortune 500 companies, small businesses, startups, everything in between. And I think the things that have served me best so far is getting really good at networking and figuring out what that means, because it's a scary word, but all it really means is connecting with people. And we can all do that in various different ways. It might be that nobody's comfortable in a room full of people right now, but it might be that I'm less comfortable in a sort of, drinks, happy hour networking setting than I am just meeting someone over coffee and putting all the skills I learned back in 2007 to use again. And also just staying in touch, having that sort of friendly approach, and making sure that you are being really direct and warm and respectful in your communications. I would say those have been the most important things. So really quick recap. Left St. Andrews, used my IR degree, learned that there was a lot about that I loved doing, but also a lot that I didn't love as much. So I started moving into the private sector. And after doing that for 4 or so years, I ultimately decided to sort of step out on my own. And for the last, almost 4 years again now, because election years are how I keep track of my business, I've been doing leadership coaching, group workshops and facilitations, and culture consulting, and I'm growing my little team at Penciler Inc. along the way as well. So I'm going to stop talking and give Sabi a chance to unmute.
Thank you so much for that, Ellie. Right. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and you can then share your questions, or you can just type them in the chat. I think I will start with one question, and then I'll give people enough time to ask theirs after. So I think that's one of the main questions to ask. So what's been the biggest obstacle you've faced so far ever since starting Pencil Ink?
Gosh. I think the biggest one is sales. And I think it's more the sort of reputation that sales has. I think everyone, when they start a business, it's not because they say, you know, I want to spend a lot of time writing proposals and on QuickBooks and dealing with all that other stuff that goes with starting a business. I think it's because they're good at other things. And for me, that was communications and coaching and working with the types of clients that I mentioned. So I thought, oh, how am I going to get into sales? And what's helped is the recognition that ultimately it's about working with people that you like and that like you. And fortunately, sort of my business superpower, if you like, is connecting with people, like I mentioned. And ultimately, that's what sales is. So coming back to that every so often has been great, and recognizing that I don't have to be a sort of, you know, cold calling, brash sales stereotype that I'm picturing that probably doesn't even exist. But most of my I would say almost all of the business that I get is through word of mouth and referrals, which I think really kind of bolsters that idea that you do. Sometimes the fear of some aspect of starting your own business will get in the way when it might be unfounded. But also I think it's important to recognize there are some things that we just aren't good at, and we try and we adapt and we get better. I'm a coach, so I'm obviously going to say that. That being said, there's also you know, the recognition and the sort of humbling side of it that I recognize working with entrepreneurs of growing businesses. They all have blind spots or areas that they could be better at as well. So I think just sort of being self-aware about it and knowing what's not your style. Like, I can't tell you how much time I wasted at those big networking events before I realized that's not where I shine anyway. That it really sort of came together more when I had that realization, I suppose.
That's fair. We have one question, I think. Yeah, so Zoe has asked, what would you recommend for people whose degree is not as vocational as IR? How do you make yourself attractive to employers with a less relevant degree? She studies classics, she says.
I think a few things on that front. Actually, okay, I've got a bunch of thoughts on this, so bear with me. It's quite daunting to say I'm a communications expert and then kind of structure your answer very awkwardly. But I would say one is talk to other people in that field if that's what you want to pursue. So you could look up people who, for example, went to St. Andrews, but still somehow use their degree. Like my flatmate at St. Andrews is now head of classics at a private school in England. Happy to make an introduction, by the way. But I would look at what people in your field are doing and see if that interests you. Beyond that and beyond your degrees, and this is where it's hopefully more applicable, not just to the person who asked the question, Zoe, but to everybody else, is to think about, okay, well, what are my sort of differentiators? And as someone who works in communications, I'm going to say, what are your 3 differentiators? Because it's more memorable than 4. And if you only have 2, it just doesn't sound as impressive. And it could be anything from, you know, I'm great. In my case, I would say I'm a connector, like I like networking and connecting with people. But you might also add something that maybe less to do with your degree and to do with other things, like, oh, people always tell me I'm good at such and such. Thinking about what those things are, I think, is really important, because that's what really helps you stand out in a lot of different contexts. And the other piece of it, I would say, sort of loops back to my own experience on this sort of career track, is remembering that as you go through these conversations, and it is a series of conversations, whether it's interviews or informational meetings or coffees, if we're ever allowed to be in the same place again, is remembering that it's all about getting to know somebody and knowing that that doesn't mean, ironic since I'm talking so much, but that doesn't mean you have to do all the talking. In fact, you'll probably make a much better impression if you're very good at active listening, asking the occasional thoughtful question, and, you know, remembering what the person tells you, and having that, if it's somebody in a sort of career conversation, having that bit of deference for their experience and what they can teach you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Manahil wants to ask a question. Manahil, can you unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. I actually have quite a few, so I'm just going to try and prioritize the ones that I find are probably most relevant. One of the things about essentially what you've done, you've really sort of went and fringed and you created your own business. There's a lot of instability attached to that. And I think as students, I think it's quite normal to be in a position where roles like consulting don't necessarily have the most consistent promise as opposed to something more like some 9-to-5 accounting job. So my question is sort of just like, how do you feel through the work that you've been doing in consulting? Do you feel like it's a steady job? What are the hours like?
Yeah, and I think that's an important way to think about it. And thank you for the question. So a couple of things. One is, when you think about consulting, it could mean like a very steady setup. Like, I mean, nothing's steady at the moment, so I should caveat that. But it could mean like a very traditional sort of consulting firm, like Deloitte or Boston Consultant Group or McKinsey or one of those, in which case tougher to get in potentially than just going out there and calling yourself a consultant, which was the much easier route I took, easier in some ways. But so I think there can be a lot of stability if that's what you're looking for. And then maybe after that, you could go out and be a consultant, freelancer, you know, entrepreneurial consultant on your own and have that kind of sort of burnished credential of having worked at a big firm. The going out on your own, it is a little bit scary. And I have been quite lucky in that I've had this sort of stability. I had a chance to kind of build my experience in other settings. I'm always, and I think that's a really important part of entrepreneurship and leadership, like knowing that there's always more you can know and do differently and better. But I think what helped me was sort of dipping a toe in. Like when I left my last company, I didn't say, I'm going out, I'm starting a competitor to your business, like bye everyone. I left and I decided to do a bit of freelancing first. Like I never really thought, okay, this is a step on my career path towards consulting. I just thought this is what I'm going to do now. And the sort of personal side of it was I'd had a baby. Maternity leave here in the US is terrible. The rumors are true. But I ended up going part-time and spent most of my time with my baby, who's now about to turn 5. But like a big part of it was just sort of dipping my toe in and doing a little bit of consulting, freelance work here and there. I also know people who've taken a similar route but been able to do it with a bit more stability. So they've maybe worked part-time somewhere and then pursued their sort of side hustle, passion project, whatever you want to call it. Those are all like cringeworthy names to me, but they've sort of pursued that alongside so they can build their experience. And another, I think for anyone really, is thinking about what about your experience thus far makes you a good consultant. Like looking back, me being scrappy about trying to find an employer to get a visa was quite entrepreneurial. It probably would have been maybe not easier, but different and maybe more stable if I just applied to bigger companies and not gone the nonprofit route. So thinking about those things, I think can make it, you know, it can make a difference as well. And the only other thing I'd say about that is having a good sort of, not just a network in terms of people you might sell to or might give you a job or whatever, but having a good network in terms of people in a similar spot. Like I think St. Connect is really helpful in that respect. But for me as an entrepreneur, I found it really helpful to be a part of a couple of entrepreneur groups as well, kind of support groups for entrepreneurs, because it can be kind of lonely. But having those things really makes it different as well and opens different doors for you as well.
That's super helpful. Thanks so much.
I think, Fraser, can you ask your question?
My question would just be, what do you think is your long-term goals for your firm?
Long-term goals for my firm. So everything changed a little bit about 6 months ago. But I think it hasn't changed the sort of longer term goals, which is to sort of evolve with the market. So I started out thinking, okay, well, I'm an experienced coach, like executive coaching, leadership coaching, that sort of thing. I'm an experienced facilitator, so I want to do those things, and that will be my business. Since then, I've listened to and learned more from clients in terms of, it used to be when I started out 8 years ago now in this sort of industry, people would say, oh, we want coaching for this person. We're going to do a one-off workshop on this, and we want to do X, Y, and Z. What I found now, and I think it's partly the market changing, but I also think it's partly my sort of expertise changing as well. People come to me and they say, our culture lacks empathy. What can we do? Or they'll say, we need people now that we're not just a small, scrappy startup, but we're becoming a much more professional organization that attracts different types of employees. We need more accountability, because it's not like a small room of 3 founders where everybody's wearing every hat and everybody's hyper responsible, usually. It's more people are there for the 9 to 5 and the paycheck, and you can't fault them for that, but it's a different sort of approach to accountability, right? Or people might come in and say, there's a company I'm working with at the moment, for example, they reached out last year through a referral and said, we need help with an empowerment initiative. And I said, well, great, but what is that? Because I want to know what your definition of empowerment is, because it's very buzzwordy, to coin a new buzzword, or an old one. And what does that mean? And they basically said, well, people aren't decisive enough. So when you have an organization of 500 people, it's smallish insurance company. When you have that size of organization, it creates a lot of bottlenecks if everybody runs every decision up through the hierarchy before they will just move and make their decision. As a sidebar, I love the idea that an insurance company is very risk averse, even when it comes to like day-to-day decision making. So the sort of trend that I'm seeing and what sort of shapes the evolution of the business so far, and what I think will continue to in future, is this idea that instead of just saying we want this quick fix engagement, people will say, here's like a deep-seated cultural challenge we're having as an organization, because now we've grown, or now things are changing, or now everybody's working from home, and what do we even stand for, right? What are our values? Who do we hire when we don't actually meet people face to face anymore? It's more about culture and shaping culture and looking at what's different about that. So that sort of expanded my approach into not just the sorts of things that I mentioned, but when I think about consulting on culture, I'll say, okay, well, let's do a culture analysis. I or someone from my team will interview a cross-section of people from across your organization and get a sense of what defines the culture, what's working, what's not, what they would change, that sort of thing. And then we'll say, okay, well, let's have a keynote address about empowerment in this example. Let's do a series of workshops for key people. One thing I noticed in these calls with this particular organization is everyone refers to the organization as they or them, like, oh, they did this and they did that other thing. And it really struck me as remarkable, because some of these employees had been there for 25 years and it was still, well, they did this and they did that. And okay, I'm used to working with New York startups where everybody's like part of the family. But this really struck me. And I noticed that the people on the leadership team didn't do it and people in HR didn't do it. For them, it was like we and us. And just being able to recognize that really got me excited, but it also helped add another goal to what we were trying to do. So very meandering answer, Fraser, but essentially, I think it's going to be more about culture as the entry point versus a sort of one-off coach this person and fix them or help this high potential person or whatever it may be.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really interesting.
Okay, Niv, do you want to ask your question?
So obviously you've had a good amount of experience in the US. So I was wondering, as far as like navigating that and everything is concerned, if you had any kind of like tips or information that you thought was important.
Yes.
And yeah, sorry. And I was gonna say specifically like coming from a UK school, and if there's like anything that is important with that.
Yeah, and I think probably Andrew will have interesting thoughts on this as well. But I would say a couple of things. One is that if it's a strength to come in as an outsider in some ways, like it can instantly be that you have that international experience, right? Because that's different. And so I think this applies to Zoe's question earlier as well, is thinking of sometimes being much more sort of focused and specific versus going in and on day one of my job search when I was a student, I would be like, I'm just really glad to be here and I will take a job doing anything, right? Which is so tempting. Whereas if you say, I'm really good at these following things, or in the case of Niv's question, like I have international experience, this is the very specific thing that interests me and that I think is interesting that you're doing. So let's talk about that, right? I think that makes a difference. In terms of this, in doing businesses in the two places, I I have some experience working in the UK with London, and growing up in Scotland, I had various student jobs and summer jobs and that sort of thing. But that's the caveat, is my experience is old, right, from over there. But I would say, like, I work a lot with the Scottish government on helping Scottish companies move into the US, and various sort of parallels and differences come up. Like, people, obviously my lens is New York and London, so that's already kind of skewed, right? But like, people compare New York and London a lot, but there's a lot of differences there too. Like, I think it's very easy in New York to connect with people in a very quick and almost superficial way, right? Like, you can, in the before times, like, go to a yoga class and make 3 new friends, right? Whereas in London, I found it was a much slower burn to connect with people. And I think the same is true in business. I would also say in the UK, and if I'm working with British people now and British companies now, there's much less, how do I want to put this? So in New York, if you see someone on a company website who interests you and you're in a similar field, or even if you're not, you can send them an email and say, hey, I think your background looks really interesting. I'm working on such and such. Shall we get a coffee? And pretty much always people say yes, right? It's a little different when you're a student and you're brand new to things, because they're kind of thinking, well, this is more kind of one-sided because this person clearly wants a job, right? So that's another caveat. But I would say in the UK, often people will turn down the meeting if there isn't an immediate sort of business reason for meeting. They might say, well, I don't want to kind of lead you down a false path. We're not looking to change our vendors, or like, it's much more sort of business focused. Whereas in New York, it's more, let's forge a relationship and then we'll figure out the rest later and we'll keep in touch. And that's great, right? There's more of a formality, I think, in the UK. And I would say other things, people are much more openly ambitious here. And I, you know, as an entrepreneur, I think that's great. And I think just one very quick thing, because I know I'm almost out of time, but with my daughter, who, as mentioned, is turning 5, like, I remember once saying to her, oh, don't be so bold, because my mom's Irish and I was born in Ireland, even though I grew up in Scotland. But like, that was the way she would like admonish me and my siblings. She'd be like, oh, don't be so bold. It was just a synonym for being naughty, right? For misbehaving. And my husband, who's American, was like, you know, boldness is something we aspire to here. And to me, that just sort of summed up the differences, where I'm like, yeah, I don't want to tell my kids not to be confident. Like, I don't want them to be arrogant and rude, but I do want them to have that sort of confidence and ambition and be comfortable with that. So I think that's a little bit of a tangent, but I do think it relates to how people work and do business. Like, there's almost, if you are very, very ambitious in Scotland, and again, my lens is growing up near Dundee, people kind of be like, well, who do you think you are saying that you're going to live in New York? You know, like, they'd be happy for you, but there's always like a note to it, right? Whereas here it's, oh, gee, good for you. Like, go for it. Yeah. And otherwise very flawed society, as everywhere is. But in terms of ambition and being comfortable with sort of entrepreneurship, there's no better place than here, I would say.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we can have one more question. Arthur, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much. Hello. A quick question. So, like, when you do the consulting job, like for a company, right? So, like, do you just like focus on like crafting a strategy for them, but or do you kind of like mix up both strategy as well as implementation? Thank you.
So I didn't quite catch your question, Arthur. So you were asking about if you want to work for a consulting company. Would you mind repeating it?
Yeah, sure. So let's say like you do a job like for a company, right? Like for a client. So like, do you just like focus on like crafting a strategy for them, like how to implement that, or like do you also go and help them to implement that?
Got it. Okay, so I'm more sort of hands-on with implementation, but it's all through the lens of, if we're talking about coming back to the example I used about this insurance company where they want a more empowered culture, right? Like, I want everything I do with them to be very personalized to them, hence this sort of culture analysis process where I called everyone up, as mentioned. But I also want it to have a lasting impact. And it's not going to have a lasting impact if I say they're in New Hampshire. If I say, okay, now I'm going to move to New Hampshire for 3 years to make sure you do it right, right? Like, I want to teach them to fish, so to speak. So I want to make everything so they can, once they've learned the ropes, they can execute it on their own. So rather than saying, I'm going to coach all 500 people in your company, I would say to them, let's get coaches for 20 key people across different departments. And let me help you set up a peer coaching program so this can live on without me. Like, let's make this initiative something that's not just about, oh, we had that person come up from New York and they gave a good presentation and then we all moved on with our lives. But what can they actually do with it to make it have a much more lasting impact on their own? So helping them with the implementation, but not necessarily doing it myself beyond the sort of initial engagement.
Thank you. It's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Ellie. That was really helpful and quite inspiring as well. Your journey from the UK to the US and opening up Penciler Inc. So thank you for that. And I think everyone who had questions gained a lot from your answers. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Sabby, and thanks, everyone.
Great. Now I would like to introduce, Bonnie, do you want to start another recording?